a lot of people tend to like using scopes in the Battlefield games, because they might give them a better view of a target ahead, or because they often provide you with a bit of extra zoom, making it easier to land shots on players further away. It's a personal preference, but it's a preference that a lot of people tend to share, because they can sometimes make a gun feel tad easy to aim with, often giving the user a clearer view. But if you don't fancy using any scopes or optics, then your weapon's going to come fitted with its very own iron sights, which in most cases can get the job done fine enough. But throughout the Battlefield series, although there's a whole pile of guns that have some pretty decent sight pictures, there's also quite a lot that are just screaming to have some optical attachments slapped onto them instead, with their iron sights being obstructive, awkward to use, or just downright friggin' awful to look at, giving you barely any reason at all to use them over a scope. They might function fine in reality, though perhaps not so much in the games. And today we're going to be taking a look at some of the nastiest iron sights you'll be able to find in this series. Here's my top 20 worst iron sights in the Battlefield games. So to start us off, we've got the MAZ-44 from Battlefield 5, which isn't too terrible, but it's still not quite as clear as most of the others. With the MAZ-44 being the semi-auto rifle, precision plays a massive role in doing well with it, though it's not always super easy to acquire targets with its iron sights, due to there being quite a lot to look at while you aim. That front notch is pretty clear to see, being a little triangle sticking up in the middle, but then you've got that hoop wrapping around it, along with the other hoop at the rear sight that sometimes gets in the way a bit. Especially if you have to quickly snap to a target or lead a player's movements from further away. Not too bad if you just need to land a few shots on a guy up close, as you can just use the hoop rather than the front post. But otherwise it's not always the most ideal, especially if you need to rely on that front post to hit someone in the distance. Next up on the list is the AWS light machine gun from Battlefield 4, a gun with a lot of bullets and a lot of iron sight to go with it. Now aiming in with this guy takes up a pretty big chunk of the screen, with the sides of the gun's rear sight creating a bit of a tunnel on your screen, and then you've got to look through a pretty small hole in the centre to see the three-pronged foresight in the middle. The foresight isn't the problem, because it's actually quite easy to see and distinguish, with that centre post being fairly narrow and clear to aim with. But you've got to get past everything else on the screen at the same time, only being able to see your targets if they happen to be at the end of that tunnel in the small gap. If they run either side, or if there's a few guys on the screen at once, then you're often going to have a bit of a hard time trying to track them, sometimes making the AWS's iron sights feel a little bit clumsy to use. Going back to Battlefield 5 next with the M1941 Johnson, another semi-automatic rifle that actually came along quite late in the game's life cycle. Now looking down the M1941 sights, you'll probably be able to see why I've decided to stick this thing on here. That rear sight is literally just a big block with a hole in the middle. Not exactly giving you the clearest sight picture, and not exactly looking very nice either. Just like with the last gun, the Johnson's still totally usable, with that front sight being quite clear and easy to see. So if you can get past the fact that it looks ugly as hell when you ADS, you'll still be able to use it fine enough in a lot of cases. Though peeping through a hole to aim isn't really the most practical thing to do in a Battlefield game, especially if you're needing to constantly be aware of your surroundings, and get yourself ready to take on several enemies that might decide to pop out at once to cause you a bit of a problem. The next iron sights on the list aren't actually exclusive to a specific gun, because you can choose to use them on quite a few different rifles, if you really want to. These are Battlefield 1's RADIUM sights, and why I'd prefer to use them over stock iron sights is a bit of a mystery to me. Apart from looking a bit funky with all that rave paint on, the RADIUM sights don't really offer you with a very clear sight picture overall. It's another block with a hole in the middle, only this block ends halfway up, but still creates a bit of an obstruction for when you need to lead targets' movements. Considering the RADIUM sights are commonly used with the game's bolt-action rifles, not being able to lead moving targets very well can be a pretty big drawback. They probably won't cause too many issues against players up close, but the way these sights are designed does make them seem a bit trickier for being precise over mid to long ranges, which kinda goes against the whole point of using them in the first place. In 16th place, we've got the Scar H from Battlefields 3 and 4. This gun's iron sights look slightly different between the games, but neither of them are particularly very good, with them looking a bit like a bell with a hole cut in the middle in Battlefield 3, and just simply looking like a thick post with a hole punched through the middle in Battlefield 4. The gun itself doesn't really take up very much screen at all in ADS, so you'll still be able to see the battlefield quite well, But the Scar H's iron sights still aren't exactly the best, having to peek through all that metal to be able to see your targets ahead. The front notch on Battlefield 4 is actually more rectangular shaped than it was in Battlefield 3, making it feel slightly less precise when you're engaging targets further away. Nevertheless though, the Scar H's iron sights aren't exactly brilliant in neither of the games, so it's a weapon that deserves to be on the list. Going over to Battlefield 1 next with the BAR M1918, which likes to fill up a pretty big chunk of the screen and bounce around a fair bit as you fire away. The iron sights themselves aren't too terrible, being relatively clear and simple, but the overall sight picture can seem a bit cumbersome, especially when you quickly need to aim in to get a good view of someone, or when you need to skip from target to target and gun down multiple players one after the other. The frame around the sight itself does have a tendency to jump around a bit while you hold down the trigger, which can be a bit off-putting at times, and it does take up a fairly big part of the screen, somewhat limiting your view compared to a lot of the other weapons in the game. The BAR's not got the worst iron sights, but they are a little bit ugly and clumsy in Battlefield 1, and the AA sight is probably going to give you a better overall view of what's ahead, should you decide to run with the weapon. Next up is another light machine gun in the form of the good old M60 from Battlefield 4. A weapon with some of the most unique looking iron sights in the game, but not necessarily very good ones. You've got a small metal window to look through, where you'll be able to see that front notch in the middle of the screen. The rear sight itself isn't too obstructive or hard to look past, but the main problem is mainly down to that front notch you've got to aim with, basically being a fat block. Often a bit of an awkward thing to aim with if you want to be accurate over longer distances. The M60's iron sights weren't exactly great in Battlefield 3 either, but at least the 4 sight was more narrow and easier to aim with, giving it a higher level of precision. It was a pretty clear downgrade going into Battlefield 4, and to make matters worse, that blocky front sight still gets in the way a bit, even if you stick on some optical attachments, with it protruding upwards and being a bit of a nuisance. Staying in Battlefield 4 for the time being with the AK-5C, the first fully automatic carbine you'll be able to use in multiplayer. It's got some pretty distinguished iron sights, with the front notch being visible enough for them to be used effectively, but you've still got a bit of an obstructive view overall, with the rear sight having quite a lot of parts that stick out and block vision. The hooped rear sight is quite thick, and sort of makes it harder to see stuff directly in front of you. Plus the 2 sides also take up a fair bit of screen space too. This will probably be enough to make most people want to use the gun with some optics instead, with there being too much stuff that gets in the way, making the weapon feel more awkward to use in general play. Especially within short to mid distances, where the AK-5C is designed to excel. Coming in at 12th place is Battlefield 5's M1928A1, which actually has one of the cleanest looking foresights in the series, with it coming to a needle-like point, but is generally let down by all the other stuff going on around it, blocking off sightlines and acting as a bit of a distraction. It's sort of like a worse version of Battlefield 1's Annihilator, which was a bit clearer and more simplistic, kinda resembling looking down a canyon to see your target ahead. Perhaps not really something you want to have to do when you're running around, gunning down players within shorter distances, surrounded by danger. Those iron sights don't exactly help your accuracy out, with the gun already being a bit of an awkward thing to control in full auto fire, so this might be another reason why the M1928 tends to be a better hipfire weapon, as you can bypass those fiddly looking sights altogether in close quarter fights. Otherwise you could just attach some optics, which will probably help your accuracy out, but still kinda look a bit out of place on a World War II Tommy gun. In 11th place on the list is Battlefield 1's M1903 Springfield, but more specifically that experimental variant, which transforms that bolt-action rifle into a semi-automatic weapon instead. It might be using the same foresight at the front of the gun, but now it's got that bulky Pedersen device attached to it too, blocking out a much larger area of the screen in ADS and making it look really bloody ugly as a result. The M1903's actually got some of the better iron sights in the game, but that experimental variant sort of ruins them, with the Pedersen device now acting like a bit of a valley, making that front sight seem smaller and harder to see. Not to mention the fact that you've now also got that stick magazine popping up from the right side of the gun too, giving the experimental variant a pretty dodgy looking sight picture overall. Not great, considering you need to land quite a few bullets to put other players down beyond close range. If you thought the Madsen was a bit of an awkward bugger to use at times, then wait till you see Battlefield 5's Type 97, which looks pretty similar, but takes up even more screen space with an even beefier magazine. Some weapons like the Madsen, Bren and Perino are less desirable because of the gun obstructing your view rather than the sights themselves being less visible or awkward to use. This is definitely the case with the Type 97, which has the same problems with its sight picture blocking out huge chunks of the screen. But out of all of the weapons that have fat magazines sticking out of their heads, protruding into your view, this is easily one of the most obstructive, not only having a much chunkier magazine, but also having a pretty thick hoop sight that you'll need to look through to see the notch at the end. The front notch itself is quite thin and easy to use, but everything else creates blind spots, where enemies could be hiding out of sight, giving you a less than ideal view of the battlefield ahead while you're aiming down those sights. Some pretty awkward iron sights from Battlefield 1 belong to the Enfield M1917, a rifle that excels over longer ranges, so seems a bit daft using iron sights anyway, in the first place. Not only does that rear sight look really bulky with that metal ring being the main focal point, but within that thick metal ring is a teeny tiny stick, in between the left and right posts, making up the front part of the sight. It's certainly not the clearest sight picture, with quite a lot of stuff that has to be looked past in order to spot that little post in the centre, which sometimes gets lost amongst the environment and everything else, sort of being overcome by the frame at the back too. Because that middle post is so small, this does actually make it more usable against players far away in the distance, so in a way it kinda suits the gun's purpose. But because the M1917's rear sights can be more obstructive than other guns, this sometimes makes it seem a bit cumbersome, and trickier to use against players within those closer to medium ranges, especially if they're strafing around from side to side, trying to avoid your shots. Battlefield 5's Type 11 suffers from a similar problem to the Type 97, in the sense that the iron sights themselves are okay enough, allowing the gun to be precise over different ranges, but the gun blocks off lines of sight when you're using them, or in this case, pretty much the entire left side of the friggin' screen. If an enemy player happens to be on that left side while you're aiming down the gun's sights, then they're not going to be seen, and it's probably going to be lights out for you. Of course, the entire right side of the screen is wide open for your viewing pleasure, but you're still left with a lot of screen space that's being blocked off that'll reduce your general visibility further, and most likely get you killed from unexpected angles. The fore and rear sights themselves are decent enough, but still aren't exactly the clearest compared to other weapons, and overall you've got a gun that takes up a lot of bloody screen, and can often seem a bit clumsy to use as a result. Another variant of the Tommy gun is up next, in the form of the M1A1 Thompson, when it's made its way into Battlefield Hardline's Criminal Activity DLC. This gun isn't compatible with any optical attachments, so those bog standard iron sights are your only option if you want to run with this gun, which is probably one of the main reasons why a lot of people don't bother. It's pretty obvious why I've decided to stick this gun on the list. Not only have you got to look past those giant bat ears, but the rear sight, which is basically that big block at the back, kinda gets in the way of the front sight from both sides, making it all look a bit flat and tricky to be precise with, especially if you strafe around while you're trying to line that front sight up with your target, which tends to like hiding behind the rear sight when you do. Not too bad if your enemy's at point blank range, but otherwise, unless you plan on staying still all the time, this generally poses a problem if you want to use the M1A1 competitively. Next up on the list is the Type 2A from Battlefield 5, which have got some iron sights that are a bit reminiscent of the M1941 Johnsons, only even worse still. The Type 2A's irons are literally just a square block with a hole in the middle, and although the weapon itself doesn't really get in the way very much or take up a big portion of the screen like with other guns, trying to be accurate with this thing is still a pretty tough ordeal. A lot of that can be blamed on the SMG's fire rate and recoil pattern, causing the gun to kick around and lose accuracy and stability. But the iron sights are still to blame here too, with that big metal plate at the back often getting in the way, as while the gun skips around, it'll keep blocking off your view of your targets in front, being a bit of a pain in the arse, with it taking up a lot of space around the edges of the sight. The Ace comes in many forms in the Battlefield games, but they all share the same crappy iron sights that are pretty awful to try and use effectively. Despite the middle post practically being a needle, it sort of gets squashed in the middle of your sight picture by the side posts and rear sight, all looking a bit claustrophobic. And considering the Ace rifles and carbines have a tendency to shoot fairly quickly, this doesn't exactly go in its favour, with those iron sights jolted around, meaning those side posts are constantly going to be getting in the way as you try and stay locked onto your target. The ace weapons are some of the most popular ones in Battlefield 4, but they're definitely not popular because of those iron sights, with almost all of its users opting for scopes and optical attachments, so they don't have to put up with looking through a bloody grill every time they want to take someone on. In 4th place is Battlefield Hardline's SA-58 OSW, a pretty hard-hitting battle rifle that has one of the narrowest iron sight gaps in the series. The problem with this thing isn't so much the iron sights themselves, but more so the angle that you seem to look down them, with the front sight and barrel practically taking up most of your view, only giving you a slither of space to peek through at the top. Where most of the other rifles' front sights appear to be more in the middle of the hoop, the SA-58 seems to have its front sight set higher, to the point where you can't really see very much, with the rear hoop getting in the way as you try and aim at a target ahead. This makes it trickier to see people directly in front of you, and stay on target while the weapon violently kicks around. And without a scope, this can often make the gun feel more awkward to use than it probably should be. The next rubbish iron sights in the list belong to the QBU-88, a semi-automatic rifle from Battlefields 3 and 4. I think it's pretty obvious why I've decided to stick this gun on here. Aiming with the QBU-88 iron sights is like trying to aim at someone through a hole in the wall. Because of the weapon's rear sight, it looks like you're trying to peep straight through the middle of the gun itself. Of course, you're not doing that, but that's sort of what it looks like. This is going to obstruct your view around the sights in a massive way, making it harder to track targets in front of you and generally keep a good level of accuracy as you play. Definitely not a good thing for any weapon, but especially a DMR, where landing or missing shots could mean the difference between taking down your target or ending up back on the spawn screen. It's no surprise that most people who use this gun do so with a scope, giving them a much clearer view of the battlefield and their enemies ahead, because using those iron sights are usually going to put you at a very big disadvantage. It's practically impossible to make a list of worst iron sights without talking about the FAMAS, a gun notorious for having some shockingly bad ones. A lot of people call them the butthole sight, because it's literally just a hole punched through a thick chunk of metal, giving you a really crappy view of anything in front of you. The FAMAS has never really had decent iron sights in any of the Battlefield games it's featured in, from BF3, BF4, Battlefield Hardline. They've always been nothing short of terrible, especially in Battlefield 3 where the hole you've got to peek through is really friggin' tiny. Considering the weapon's got such a rapid fire rate and erratic recoil pattern to go with it, this makes those iron sights feel even worse still, barely even usable against players beyond close range. If you choose to equip the FAMAS, don't forget to equip some optics, you're gonna need them. So probably my worst iron sights in the Battlefield games happen to belong to the Uzi from Battlefield Hardline, which sorta looks a bit like a mashup between several other guns in this list, ultimately making them pretty awful. I guess you could say that the Uzi's sights are kinda similar to the FAMAS's, only on a smaller scale, making it even more awkward to use effectively. You've got another big chunk of metal surrounding that small hole you've got to look through to see the front notch in the middle, which also happens to be pretty tiny too, making the whole thing seem really uncomfortable to aim with. Way too much stuff is obstructing your view, and that teeny foresight more often than not just gets lost in the action. I guess the only saving grace for the Uzi is the fact that this gun doesn't have a hell of a lot of recoil, but this still doesn't make those iron sights any better, easily being some of the worst in the series. So those are my top 20 worst iron sights in the Battlefield games, but do let me know which ones you think are the worst down below in the comments. And make sure you subscribe and check out my channel if you want to see more content. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in the next episode.